Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hidden Histories Collective. Well, we are bringing you another exciting presentation. I know I say that about many of them, but this one in particular is very, very important. As you guys know, there has been a lot going on the land. It seems like we are in the throes of utter chaos. And I just wanted to bring some clarity to it so that we understood it and we kept our heads and our wits about us, because it's very important that we understand what's happening to us, not only legally, physically, but also spiritually, because it's important that we remember this and honor our ancestors in this particular space. But as you can see, the title of this particular presentation is The U.S. Government Was Built on Indigenous Law. Now, many of you will probably understand this and know this. I think it's very important that it is said and put on the record, at least from our perspective here at the Hidden Histories Collective, because so much of what we do here is education, but we're not just educating each other, we're educating the world. So this is why we do what we do. So as you guys can see, I'm going to break down this presentation in contents. I'm going to talk about Westlake, incident that happened here in Los Angeles a few weeks ago. We're going to talk about spiritual contracts, indigenous government, the Albany Plan, the Constitution, how nations handled disruptors, and some final thoughts on the Great Mothers. Now, one of the things I wanted to show you guys here, for those of you who aren't familiar with what happened in Los Angeles a few weeks ago, we had an incident here with federal agents basically kind of taking over a certain area of Los Angeles called Westlake. I'm going to show you that clip right now to get you guys up to speed as to what happened.
MacArthur Park becomes the latest scene of a massive presence of immigration enforcement agents, heavily armed federal agents on horseback in military vehicles descending onto that park.
This time things ended differently than we've seen in the past. Fox 11's Laura Diaz live in downtown LA with more on what happened out there today. Laura.
Yes, the big question tonight is, what was the purpose of the show of force? We can tell you that there were not that many people present in the park when that raid took place. And unlike other raids, advance word leaked out. Fox 11 was on the ground and up in the air.
This is an overreach of your authority.
By 11:10, there was tanks and all this. They got tanks all through here. They got the white vans. They got the trucks. They got all this out.
About 10:30 Monday morning, heavily armored Border Patrol officers with a fleet of vehicles and some on horseback descended on MacArthur Park. This is the heart of the immigrant community, just 2 miles from downtown LA. Sky Fox was overhead as the operation kicked in. Our Fox 11 photographer, Sam Dubin, on the ground, recording the dramatic scene. Immigration agents in military green carrying rifles. Neighbors and community activists rushed to the park, challenging those in the action. Children were scurried from the urban park.
The military pointed their guns at us and they were screaming at us, cursing to get the out of there.
Among those arriving on the scene was LA Mayor Karen Bass, flanked by security and in a crush of people pushing for the operation to end. Our camera caught her on the phone, pleading with officials to stop.
You're getting ready to leave? Okay, please, can you leave ASAP?
My comment is they need to leave, and they need to leave right now.
Soon after, the operation ended, reportedly with not one undocumented person taken into custody. A couple of hours later, a news conference was called at LA City Hall, with the mayor surrounded by community activists and city council members denouncing the raid. Fox News spoke exclusively with Border Patrol Chief Gregory Bavino, who had tough words for Bass.
The federal government is not leaving LA. I don't work for Karen Bass. The federal government doesn't work for Karen Bass. We're going to be here till that mission's accomplished, as I said, and better get used to us now, because this is going to be normal very soon.
He's calling for you to get used to it. What is your response?
I'm not going to get used to it. I'm not going to get used to it because last I checked, I was elected to be mayor of the city. That did not include a federal takeover. So either you believe in democracy or you don't.
Homeland Security would not confirm or deny if they arrested anyone today. What I can tell you with certainty is that Fox 11 was over the scene in MacArthur Park for an entire hour. During that time, we did not witness anyone get arrested. I'm Laura Diaz reporting live from downtown, sending it back to the studio.
Now, as you guys can see, that incident was very, very telling, and it said a lot about what is happening here in Los Angeles, but not just here in LA, but on the land in particular. And I use Westlake as a case study simply because what we're seeing here is in many ways a representation of what we as Indigenous people used to do when we had disruptors on the land, or what we deemed as disruptors. So, but to give you guys a little bit of history about Westlake in particular, is that Westlake was one of the first areas of Los Angeles that was west of Figueroa Street to see residential development. And it came to have a very significant Jewish population. And if you walk around the neighborhood, you'll still see a lot of remnants of the area when there was a lot of money here. I mean, there's still some money in Westlake area, but as you'll find soon, it looks really different today. It looks really, really different. And it looks different because in the 1980s, about 1 million people were displaced due to the civil war in El Salvador. And so refugees began arriving en masse to the U.S. and coming to Los Angeles in significant numbers. And what happened to Westlake, like many neighborhoods, it begins to look different when you have people coming from different countries. Now, what is really significant about Westlake in particular is that it's about maybe a 5-minute drive to downtown Los Angeles. And when the El Salvadorans came to Westlake, they formed what was called MS-13. Now, I'll give you guys all kinds of links in the description so that you guys can do your research on this. A lot of the things that I'm referencing in the video so that you can do a deeper dive. Now, MS-13, for most people, you've probably heard that name a lot, but they actually started to protect themselves against the other gangs here in Los Angeles, but it expanded like a lot of gangs do, and they began setting up, kind of enclaves in cities Pico Union, Westlake, and the Rampart neighborhoods, which is has a lot of crime. I'll just say LA has crime in a lot of spaces, but particularly anywhere near the downtown corridor, you will see a lot of activity. And so by 2020, it was estimated from the El Salvadoran government that MS-13 had employed or were employing somewhere between 60,000 people, making them the largest employers in the country. So as you can see, that is significant. It's not just a street gang. They are an organization. And now, according to the U.S. Attorney's Office, MS-13 is one of the largest criminal organizations in the country, with about 6,000 to 10,000 members in at least 46 states and the District of Columbia. So that's significant. So when you talk about Los Angeles in particular, what you were seeing in terms of the federal troop movement was a response to MS-13 and their presence in the neighborhood. Now, as you guys know, President Donald Trump signed a lot of executive orders, and on January 20th, he basically initiated the process to designate various drug cartels and transnational gangs, including MS-13, as foreign terrorist organizations. And so the order was officially enacted on February 20th, making such groups officially terrorist organizations. So what is not often talked about at least not here in Los Angeles, in Los Angeles media, is that we have a serious security threat here. And and this began years ago, even when they even labeled the Bloods and the Crips as domestic terrorists. Okay, so that this is how deep it gets, you guys, and this is how the government has been responding to the criminal activity that is really, really organized. And so that is why Westlake, in my estimation, based on my study, intensive study, as to why the federal government was there that day, it wasn't about immigration. That's just a small portion of what is being, I guess you could say, carried out here in the Los Angeles area, Los Angeles County, and beyond. So, but this puts me to the topic of spiritual contracts, because when we talk about what's happening on the land, it's all connected to our indigenous culture and why we are here in the first place. And I'll circle back to Westlake, but I think it was really, really important to start off with that, because I wanted to show you guys what that looks like when you have, I guess you can say, disruptive elements on the land. And for our culture, many of us just would, quite frankly, remove people, and in some cases disappear them altogether. So, but that's another topic. We'll get to that later. But let's talk about spiritual contracts. We're going to go back in time a little bit, because one of the things we have to understand is that when the colonists first arrived in North America, many of them understood that they had just entered a very, very sacred space. They could see that, and they saw that the country was beautiful and breathtaking in many ways. And that is why they came. They came not only to make a better life for themselves, but because of what they knew North America, or America, to be. Now, but what they did not know or fully understand was that they had walked into a spiritual agreement with Mother Nature and the people of the land. And their responsibility was to honor both. Right? It's one thing to pray to God and to say thank you for bringing us here. Thank you for this opportunity, as you see here in this picture, and thanking the gods, if you will. But in doing that, there is also a great deal of dishonor, as you know. Now, one of the things that the indigenous peoples gave to the colonists was the gift of knowledge, because they were deeply in tune with the rhythms of the earth. And one of the gifts they gave to the colonists was basically everything that they knew. They taught them how to hunt, how to survive harsh winters, how to plant and harvest, and how to navigate the vast landscape. And we did that as generously as we could. And there are also times when we did not do it very generously, and tried to keep the colonists off of our land. Now, remember, they had been coming here for a very long time, and we had been welcoming them, but we also knew that there was danger involved. So, without going into a lot of history in this particular presentation, I just wanted to share that those were the things that we did to, at least initially, welcome the colonists. We gave them what we knew. And they also observed us a great deal. So, but in essence, we were doing what we could to show them how to live in harmony with the land that they didn't really know very well. So, but again, as you know, by ignoring that sacred instruction, they violated the very agreement they had unknowingly stepped into, and even knowingly stepped into, for that matter. So what we're seeing today is a breach of various spiritual contracts, those unseen but very real agreements rooted in reciprocity, harmony, respect, and balance. Okay, so that's very, very critical, because when you come to anyone's homeland, that is what you do. You honor their homeland, and you don't try to take it over, right? So when it comes to the indigenous worldviews, everything is built on give and take. But if you take without giving back, you violate the universal law of balance. Yes. And you can't build a nation on stolen principles while simultaneously destroying the people and earth from which they came. You just can't do it because you're going to naturally create imbalance, which therefore leads to a spiritual debt. That is the way of the universal law, universal way of living. And I know that for many people, they don't think about it every day. They don't wake up and say, oh, I'm going to find a way to be balanced today. They just go about their business and survive. But part of living means walking in consciousness. And that is what our ancestors have taught and have been trying to teach us for several, I guess you could say, centuries. Now, let's talk a bit about Indigenous governance because we always lead with the spiritual, right? So part of that also meant that was embedded in our governance as a people. Now, I want to first talk about population for a minute because I think in order to have, as we would call, law and order, or order in the universe, or order in our communities and in our spaces, is that you have to find a way in which to do that with many, many people. Now, the traditional Western estimates of the total indigenous population of North America never exceeded a total of 3 million Indians. That's what we've been taught, right? We've been taught that. But as you and I know, that number is much, much higher. Now, one of the things I would love for you guys to do if you have an opportunity is to read Charles Mann's book, 1491. Because in his findings, and based on, of course, extensive research, the book is really heavily researched, the total population of the native North Americans at the time of the first European contacts is more likely to have numbered between 30 to 60 million. 30 to 60 million. Which, of course, when you see that number, you realize that the transatlantic slave trade is to be questioned repeatedly. And the picture that you're seeing here is the city of Cahokia. And you guys have probably heard of Cahokia. And I'll go back a slide. And Cahokia was in what they deemed to be under St. Louis. Okay, so it's smack dab in the middle of the United States. And when you look at Cahokia, based on the archaeological evidence, based on the layout of the land, and what they found was this was a very, very intricate city. Very intricate city that had been around for centuries. I can't even date it. But one of the things that we do know is that in order to have a city of this magnitude, and this is just a Cahokia, but to have a country of this magnitude meant that you had to have a great deal of governance and spiritual laws that you adhered to. Now, when we talk about governance, I'm going to speak specifically about the Iroquois Confederacy, because long before the creation of the U.S. Constitution, the indigenous nations like the Iroquois were already practicing representative democracy known as the Great Law of Peace. And the Iroquois was centered in what is now New York State, parts of Ontario, and Quebec in Canada. Now, they were a powerfully political and cultural alliance of 6 nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, and several others. And the Tuscarora in particular joined later around 1722. Okay. And now the nations, as you can saw from Cahokia, they had deeply rooted systems, and those systems were deeply rooted of justice and conflict resolution, because with that many people, you're definitely going to have conflict and misunderstandings. So contrary to modern stereotypes, indigenous governance wasn't chaotic. It was structured, deliberate, and often more focused on restoration than punishment. Because we're also talking about survival. We're talking about how to ensure each generation learns and adheres to certain cultural mores. Now, here's a migration theory, and the more I study this, the more I begin to understand as well. Now, the linguistic relatives of the Iroquois include the Cherokee, Meherrin, Nottoway, and Tuscarora, who originated in what is now North Carolina and Virginia. My family is from North Carolina, so I do a lot of study about North Carolina. But when you think about the linguistic relatives, you realize that the Iroquois may have migrated northward from the Carolinas or Appalachia, which aligns with the growing evidence from linguistics, archaeology, and oral tradition. So this suggests that what we now call the Iroquois homeland may actually be their second homeland, and that their origins lie further south. And and again, going back to the shared language between the Tuscarora, the Cherokee, and the Northern Iroquois tribes points to a common ancestry despite geographic separation. Now, I know I'm going over this pretty quickly because there's so much to unpack in this presentation, but this is just a really broad overview of intense study. But definitely, you guys look into this some more for yourselves as well. Now, we're going to dive into the Albany Plan because this is where the United States began to start to shape and begin to have some kind of form prior to the American Revolutionary War. Now, the Albany Plan was a precursor to the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So, Benjamin Franklin proposed, Franklin, along with Thomas Hutchinson, proposed this plan, and they did this at the Albany Congress of 1754. Now, Albany, of course, is in New York. Now, I want to take you guys back a little bit because Franklin's infamous quote was this, which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionably very small. All Africa is black or tawny, Asia chiefly tawny, America, exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also. And this quote came from Franklin's essay, Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind in 1751. And the woman here that you see in the picture here is actually Benjamin Franklin's mother. Correct, right. So I share this quote with you because Benjamin Franklin was basically telling you that the world was not white in terms of complexion. There were very few people who were pale in the sense of being white, right? So understanding that, Franklin was very much aware that he was in a very, very diverse community, a very, I guess you could say, community of melanated people, even though that might not would have been the term he used back then, but he was quite aware of that. So, but part of the goal for Benjamin Franklin and others was to unify the 13 colonies under one general government for common defense and coordination, especially in the face of war with the French and their indigenous allies. So Franklin looked around and said, we need to be able to protect ourselves, and we are not doing a very, very good job of uniting ourselves, protecting ourselves, and we need help. So one of the things that Franklin had done over the course of his years, he had spent several years observing and corresponding with members of the Iroquois Confederacy. And he admired many things. And one of those things was he admired their federal style structure, meaning their ability to be autonomous and govern themselves, but coming together for shared decisions. He really admired that. He also liked their use of checks and balances, their deliberation and consensus in the Grand Council. He also really admired their ability to maintain peace and unity across multiple nations. So as all of these wars are going on between the Indians and the French allying themselves against the British, one of the things Franklin realized was, you know what? They're onto something and we want a part of that. So Franklin explicitly credited the Iroquois in his writings, and he saw Indigenous unity as a political model and a challenge to colonial disunity. In a letter he wrote in 1751, again, he did a lot of writing, as you can see, quote, "It would be a very strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages should be capable of forming a scheme for such a union, and yet that a like union should be impracticable for 10 or a dozen English colonies," end quote. So Franklin's insulting the Indigenous while at the same time admiring them. At the same time admiring them. So his goal in the end was, yes, to unify the colonies using the Indigenous way, but the plan was rejected by both the colonial legislatures, who feared central control, and by the British Crown, of course, which feared colonial unity. So Benjamin Franklin was ahead of the game in terms of recognizing that there needed to be some type of governance that united the colonists, because they weren't doing a very good job of it, and it was chaotic, and there wasn't really very much that they could do, because again, yes, this was not their land, and they hadn't figured it out, and they were still trying to figure it out under British rule. So, which leads us to fast forward, drum roll, to the Constitution. Now, the colonists, like Benjamin Franklin and others, observed the Indigenous and used what they saw as a foundation for establishing what we now know to be the United States of America. So the US government didn't invent the systems we see today, they merely borrowed them. Yes. And they admitted that. In 1988, there was a resolution, and you can look this up. In 1988, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution basically acknowledging the influence of the Iroquois Confederacy on the development of the U.S. Constitution. And this resolution was also reaffirmed the government-to-government relationship between the U.S. and Indian tribes. But we know that hasn't always worked out very well. However, this is not necessarily taught in civics very much, and it's not taught in our schools, because we're taught that the glory of the U.S. Constitution was created by various colonists and other framers, but they do not share with you that the foundation of the U.S. Constitution was actually not an original idea. It was something that they borrowed, they took from, and they refined for themselves. Now, the U.S. Constitution was created officially on September 17th, 1787, and went into effect on March 4th, 1789, which is only 236 years ago. The Constitution of the U.S. is only 236 years. But here's the thing. The indigenous peoples of North America had been governing themselves for hundreds of years prior to the Europeans arriving. Hundreds of years. So it only made sense that the colonists, Benjamin Franklin and all these guys, would take, they weren't going to reinvent the wheel, in other words. They were going to take what was already in use, already in practice, and use it for themselves and for the colonies. Now, the authors of the Constitution, and I put authors in quotes because, as we know, they refined the Constitution for themselves. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And Alexander Hamilton in particular is always an interesting figure, and I have an ongoing investigation on him because he was mulatto, probably. There's evidence suggesting that he is, and he obscured his past very well, but just to evidence. Anyway, these were the quote-unquote 3 men that were involved in the forming or putting words and formality to the U.S. Constitution. And Owen John Jay was a French Huguenot, so there's that part too. So, so in addition to the authors of the Constitution, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and other prominent colonists had exposure to indigenous governance systems, especially the Iroquois. So all of these men that we talk about in history, all of them had some form of association with the indigenous because they were on our land, right? So they had seen and witnessed and experienced so much, and they saw with their own eyes what was going to work and what wasn't going to work. So to show you guys how similar the indigenous confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy was to the U.S. government, look at this. So for the Iroquois, each member had equal say in the nation, equal say for each member nation. That equates to equal state representation in the Senate. The clan mothers could remove leaders, impeachment process for removal. Now, particularly for clan mothers, this was another thing too. Women were very prominent in indigenous culture. There wasn't this, sexist way of looking at women. Women were very powerful. They had a great deal to say, and it was matriarchal, as opposed to the patriarchal systems that we are operating within today. The other similarity, Iroquois Confederacy, they had consensus-based decisions. U.S. government, majority rule with minority protections. The Iroquois had checks and balances. We have a three-branch system, executive, judicial, legislative. They had the grand law of peace, which guided governance. We have the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. So, and I can go on and on and on, but these are just some just cursory, brief examples of the things that the indigenous had, and we used and utilized it for years, decades, centuries, that the U.S. government took and adopted for themselves. Now, here is where it gets interesting. How nations handle disruptors. Now, this is really, really important, and that's why I started the presentation with the Westlake incident, because this is very interesting. Because when I think about immigration as a whole, and I think about how it's being talked about in media and in various circles, I realize that many people don't understand what immigration even means or how it's supposed to be structured. But that's why I started the presentation again with spiritual contracts and understanding how we move as a people, because there's an honor to being in existence on someone else's land. Now, some of the common practices that we practiced here was sovereignty. Outsiders had to ask permission to stay or live among the people. There were rules for entry and conduct. That's very similar to immigration laws and naturalization. You could not just come into a space, an indigenous village or indigenous nation, and just say, hey, I'm going to hang out here with you for a while. You had to be respectful to the elders, respectful to the leaders, and ask permission to stay. Another thing that we did was we had accountability. Harm to the tribe was not tolerated, and justice was community centered, not individually driven, i.e., jury trials. So we did not allow people to just, do negative things, and they did not have accountability. Again, these are all, I'm talking in very general terms here, but this is, I can get very specific, but hey, I have links to this where you guys could look specifically at what nations did. Like I mentioned earlier, the Comanche would just disappear you when you did not act accordingly. Again, to my point, exile and banishment. And this was a common response to those who disrespected tribal law, especially repeat violators or foreigners, i.e., prison and deportation. And even amongst the people, there was a feeling that even one person could disrupt the order of the community, of the village. that couldn't happen. So you were often exiled and told to leave if you did not act a certain way. So, and in all of this, there are spiritual consequences, and we moved with that understanding that if we did not pay respect to our ancestors, there would be consequences on us spiritually. So wrongdoing wasn't just legal, it also disrupted the spiritual harmony, which had real consequences for the whole community. Yes, you can say that Indigenous peoples are very superstitious, but there's some validity to that. And in many ways, we are seeing the effects, the cause and effects of what we do. Okay. Now, I do want to talk about the great mothers for a minute because it's very important to talk about them and to understand why we are here, why we're going through what we're going through as well. Now, as you know, the great mothers are the original spiritual keepers, and they are awakening. And I should say they've been awakened for some time now. And this doesn't necessarily mean vengeance, it just means correction. It means disruptions, societal fractures, exposure of secrets, and the collapse of false structures, which is what we're seeing now. And we're seeing the reckoning of broken agreements and ignored warnings. And in many Indigenous traditions, grandmothers are the enforcers of moral order when things go too far off balance. And you guys know when Big Mama's not happy about something, she's going to make it known and she's going to be the enforcer. And it doesn't necessarily mean that she'll always insert herself physically, but she would definitely insert herself spiritually. And remember, the earth also remembers. We have a contract with the earth, and the earth is neutral in this. The land is memory. Water is witness, trees are record keepers, and the very soil that was signed over in fraudulent treaties remembers what was promised and what was broken. And so when the sacred is defiled, nature responds. Nature responds through fire and famine and flood and even societal collapse. So this is why we're seeing such unrest. And those who've evaded human law, they still will face spiritual justice. And this is something that we've got to know and really feel in our hearts and feel in our souls. And the energies are being awakened and they are correcting the course, as we can see. And that's why we're seeing people like whistleblowers, vision holders, historians, scientists, so many people who are speaking the truth and putting it into the collective field. And when you put this information into the collective field, it's going to shake up people's DNA. It's going to shake up their memories. It's going to shake up their souls and their bodies and their spirit. So I leave and end with this particular presentation by asking this and leaving everyone with this. So we must ask ourselves as often as possible, are we adhering to the law? And not just legally. Are we adhering to the spiritual and physical laws that the great mothers have handed to us? So I leave you all with this information. Thank you so much again for joining us this evening on the Hidden Histories Collective. We really appreciate your support. And we'll be back next week with another presentation. And I will be following up for sure on the birthright citizenship topic. There's been a lot coming down the pipeline, a lot of new developments there. So thank you all so much. And we will be talking to you soon. Take care.